Hi, I'm Elettra, and this is CLER Researchers in Conversation. Today we're talking with Nathalie Czeke, who is currently early-stage researcher in childhood deafness and communication research in the Marie Sklodowska-Curie Innovative Training Network with Comfort Child from Brussels. She will tell us about her recent research titled Replicating the Familiar Word Effect Using an App and Automatic Coding of Fixations, written with Brown, Rippler, Zinn, Probst, and Zane. Hello, Nathalie, welcome.
Hey, Elettra, thanks for having me.
So today we're talking about your recent paper titled Replicating the Familiar Word Effect Using an App and Automatic Coding of Fixations. Do you want to tell us something about the context in which you wrote the paper and some basic informations?
Yeah, I'm happy to. So maybe I'll start with a little bit of my background because before I joined the University of Leeds and CLER itself, I was a research fellow at the University of Constance and I worked at the Baby Speech Lab, where we investigated early language acquisition and particularly speech perception. So in that context, we were looking in a specific project at word recognition. And because the pandemic hit us all really hard and we had to become a little creative with our setup. So the paper is basically a replication of a familiar word effect we see and which has been investigated in the past. And we try to replicate that effect with an online testing setup. So we created an app to see if we can get to the same results. And if we do so, if we can use it to take it a step further and look at word recognition when it's mixed with foreign language accents and native German dialectal varieties.
Oh, that sounds amazing. Do you want to tell us a bit more about what the familiar word effect is?
Yeah, so as you can imagine, doing research with infants is not as straightforward as it is with children and adults because you can't just ask them if they recognize a word when you investigate word recognition. So what we do is we take behavioral paradigms and look at looking behavior of the child to see if they recognize certain auditory input. So in this case, for example, when looking at word recognition, we have different word lists. One word list contains all the familiar words like bottle or mommy, like words that are highly familiar at the age of 1 year. And then there's a second list with words that are not known yet or even non-words, which is what we did in this case. And we play those word lists and basically look at how long does the child pay attention to these lists by looking at the speaker they are played from to see whether they can recognize the words. And the familiar word effect has been replicated a lot, and it shows that children, if they do recognize the words, pay more attention to those auditory stimuli than when listening to non-words, for example.
That's fascinating. So how did you structure this experiment with your partners?
So maybe I have to start with what we would normally do, because when families come and visit the Baby Speech Lab, we have like a booth setup basically. And so the parent will sit down with the child on their lap, and then there's a hidden camera at the front center with a little blinking light above it. And then there's the loudspeaker to the left and the right of the child, and there's blinking lights above the loudspeakers as well. So what we do is we start the experiment. So the front center light starts flashing, and the child automatically, because it's in the child's nature, directs their attention towards that blinking light, and we can see, okay, the child is ready, they're paying attention, so we can start playing the sound stimuli. So what we do next is we switch on a loudspeaker and the light either on the right or the left side of the child so that the child has to turn their head towards the speaker, which is why the whole paradigm is called head turn preference procedure. So we basically use the head turn to see if they start to pay attention towards the sound stimuli. And then we just measure how long the child keeps turning their head towards certain stimuli when they're played. So that would be the lab setup. And then we just compare the time of the head turns and the looking behavior in relation to what they were listening to at that moment. Now, because of the pandemic, we couldn't invite families to come to our lab, so we had to get creative, and we developed an app which basically does the same thing without using head turns, but just looking behavior towards a screen generally. So the child would see a colored checkerboard on an iPad or any technical device with a camera as well. And there's different trials. So it's usually about 8 seconds because you don't want to bore the child. And in these 8 seconds, the child either listens to real words, like familiar words, or non-words. And then with the camera, we measure how long within these 8 seconds the child is actually paying attention to the screen, because they will associate the sound they hear with the colorful screen. And then we basically just compare looking times between different trials, either to non-words or familiar words, by looking at the video recordings we have of them.
Oh, that sounds very, very interesting. You said that in normal conditions, you would have had the child in the lab and test whether he would turn in one place or the other accordingly to the stimulus. So because we're talking about attention, I was just wondering, how did you account for attention span? Did you test the child before?
So there is a pre-trial before the experiment, and it's a different auditory list to not bias the child afterwards. And we just measure like a default attention span, like how long would the child pay attention to that sound stimuli, and to have kind of a baseline we can compare it to. And then we repeat that pre-trial after the experiment, and that's called a post-test. So we can see if the attention span is generally still there, so we can make sure it was actually the stimuli that affected the time of attention and not the child's attention span in general. So that's like a baseline comparison we can do afterwards.
Yeah, that was exactly what I was thinking about. So that's very good. Thank you. I read that you were using Ellen. Is that right? Could you tell us something about Ellen and how you used it?
So Elan is a free video annotation and analysis software. It was created at the Max Planck Institute in Nijmegen in the Netherlands. And it basically allows us to break down the video file we have and measure looking behavior by marking certain boundaries. And so because this attention data is very time sensitive, we need to have really small units to be able to see if there is a difference in reaction time and attention span. So we can basically use Elan to go through the video frame by frame and see how looking behavior changes as the trial continues. And to do that, we have like at the beginning of each experiment, we try to make sure we kind of we know the dimensions of the device the child is looking at. So there will be a little duck appearing in each corner of the screen, and the child automatically looks at that duck. So we have reference points for the corners of that device. and we can later use those reference points when coding the video. So we can decide, okay, is the child now actually still looking at the screen, or is it looking like in the top right corner of the room and not looking at the screen anymore? So that allows us to compare those looking behaviors and make sure we code it the best way we can. And that's another thing we're working on right now. So right now it's all manual hand coding, which is a lot of work. But with 2 coders and statistical tests, it has been working quite well. And we're now trying to train an algorithm with that hand-trained data to be able to code it automatically. So we give them the reference point, see what is counted as a look, what is counted as a no look, and then it will help us to automatically analyze those videos, which will be of great help.
Of course. I was also reading that you're using this long-term recurrent convolutional network that I guess is this coder that you are saying.
Exactly.
Good. How did you train it, if I can ask?
So we basically went through each video we had so far, and there were 2 coders coding that video. We then compared inter-rater variability with a statistical test and came up with a consensus coding for each and every trial. And then we run the algorithm. We basically fed the algorithm with this data. And so the more coded trials the algorithm gets, the more accurate it becomes in recognizing the pupils of the child and following the looking behavior, and also being able to set the boundaries of the technical device the child is looking at.
That's great. Thank you. So what did you find from this? What were your findings?
Right now, we're still in the middle of collecting data. So I'm afraid I can't tell much about the findings yet, but it looks like we're replicating the familiar word effect. And we will hope to have tested about 50 children by the end of April. So I'll definitely keep you posted on what we will find.
That would be amazing. Thank you very much. And how do you find this research that you did previously to come to Leeds? How did they structure your mind into what you are becoming right now in Leeds?
That's a very interesting question, and I always ask that question myself. But I think how it links what I've done and what I'm doing now is the term of variability and inclusivity in language input. Speech perception forms a huge part of language acquisition. In fact, it's the first thing children do. And there is a whole lot of variability in that input, and that variability comes with speakers from different language backgrounds. And especially in that study we did in Constance at the time, where we also not only looked at standard German, but also dialects of German and then foreign accented speech, showed me that there's not just one right input. There's so many different kinds of inputs, and a lot of them, however, are stigmatized, like especially foreign accented speech sometimes is stigmatized as worse than standard German, for example. And even some dialectal varieties are stigmatized in that way, which is a shame because it's just the source of individual variability, basically. And I think that mind shift should switch from like considering some input as better or worse to just acknowledging the difference we have and be more inclusive, and which connects with what which with what I'm doing now, because I'm looking at multimodal communication between deaf and hearing interactants, when there is asymmetries and sensory abilities and communication abilities. And there as well, it often is said that sign language, for example, is not proper language input, and the way we communicate is often judged by or in reference to spoken language. So spoken language is often the default we have, and that is really discriminating against people who just communicate in different ways, which is by no mean worse or better. It's just different, and that hasn't been acknowledged enough, I think, and it should be pronounced in language education too, that there's so many ways of communicating, and it all does the job, and it all is part of who we are and where we come from and what we're able to do. And I think it's so much more important to shift the focus and learn from that variability and embrace it and be inclusive of everything that there is, instead of forming these categories and restricting ourselves to that.
Sure. Also, as you and I talked about a lot, communication is not just multimodal, but is something that interlaces. And so at some point you will have somebody that, even though can hear and speak one or multiple languages, would still use multimodal communication, such as the body movement and gestures, to convey meaning better. So it is absolutely multimodality is everywhere, and so it is incredible how neglected it is sometimes, right?
Definitely, for sure.
Right. So reconnecting to what we were saying before about your study, you said you were caught in the middle of your study by COVID, which is an occurrence that is unfortunately making many researchers struggling a bit more in this year and a half. So what do you think is was the more challenging part of switching from a lab environment to another type of online testing, but online on your computer, I mean?
Well, I think it was just such a big step for us, because in the lab we really try so hard to minimize all potentially confounding factors and really break it down to what we want to look at, which is of course kind of an artificial environment. But because we are looking at attention span and looking behavior, it's nice to have a lab where we can kind of control that environment and make sure it's just about speech perception, which we are investigating at the moment. Whereas using an app, we were faced with challenges like, how does the home environment look like? Like, how do we make sure the child is not distracted too much by what goes on behind the technical device surrounding the child? How can we make sure we have comparable and similar settings, because we are testing different children in one age group. So if we want to compare them and say something about the group as a whole afterwards, there needs to be a comparable setup. And we were a little concerned about that before we set up the study. As soon as we got started testing, though, we were really pleasantly surprised to see how well it actually works. And we kind of made sure to still have that comparable setup by showing a video to the parents before testing to introduce them to what the setup should look like and what they should be aware of. And I think now it has become a huge advantage of being able to test such things outside of the lab, because now we can basically test children all over Germany, or even in other German-speaking countries like Austria and Switzerland, whereas before we were really restricted to the region in and around Constance. And now that we look at dialectal variation as well, it will be a huge benefit to have that more diverse population all over the country. So I think it comes with pros and cons for sure, but keeping everything in mind, it's definitely something we will benefit in the long run, I think, because we are more flexible that way. And it's also more part of the real world, so to say. It's not all confined in that tiny booth within a lab. It's happening in the kitchen or living room of the children and where they live. So that's interesting to see and to have those opportunities on both ends.
So it's good to see that COVID also brought some opportunities for researchers as well, not just cons.
I totally agree.
That's great. Great. Thank you very much, Nathalie, for your time and your explanation of your research. And we'll see you very soon on the CLER channel.
Thank you so much for having me. My pleasure.